Hi, it's Alex. I want to look at a couple examples today of joining paragraphs. Usually in the arcing method, we're working from the micro to the macro. We spend a lot of time in the weeds, and so sometimes it's hard to move up to the upper level and follow the author's flow of thought there as well. But we follow the same method. We want to define the relationship between propositions within one sentence, right, before moving to a second sentence. We want to define the relationship between propositions in one paragraph before moving to the next paragraph. But then how do we relate paragraphs? When we've defined and arced out a paragraph, like, for instance, Hebrews 7:23-25, and then moved on to the next paragraph, say 26 through 28, and we've arced that paragraph as well, how do we begin to think about the relationship right here between those two paragraphs, let alone 3, 4 paragraphs, all the paragraphs in a chapter, all the paragraphs in a book of the Bible? Well, it's going to take a big sheet of paper, for one thing, or several sheets of paper stapled together or taped together on a wall. That's why I like to work on a whiteboard or on a chalkboard, or maybe even an app like this where I have a large canvas, even an infinite canvas, so-called, that I can work from and relate paragraphs together. But really, it's the same thing that we're doing at the propositional level. We're trying to identify the logical relationships here between each proposition, and then between each sentence, and then between each paragraph. We're still looking at what is the logical relationship. We're going to look for keywords. We're going to consider the author's flow of thought. And I want to look at a couple of examples, one from Hebrews 7 and then one from Galatians 2, because we've already looked at some arcing examples from those chapters. So here in Hebrews chapter 7, I had already arced out in a previous video 23 to 25 here. You'll remember the former priests were many in number, and this is compared to Christ's priesthood that is being held permanently, because he himself continues forever. And the consequence, the result, the inference there is that he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Then in the following paragraph, which I had a chance to look at this past week, we see that the writer says, it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest as he's describing up above. But then he goes into some of his individual personal characteristics, that Jesus was holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners and exalted above the heavens, which seems to point to the ascension of Christ. And then also his sacrifice, that he has no need to offer sacrifices on an ongoing basis, daily, like those other high priests, for his own sins and then for those of the people. But he offered his sacrifice once for all when he offered up himself. There was no need for continual sacrifice. So his priesthood is also superior in that sense. And then verse 28 sort of sums up the strength of Christ's priesthood over against the weakness of the priests who had gone before, appointed as a son who had been made perfect forever through what he suffered. And so the strength of Christ's priesthood. And if we want to look at this relationship then, right here, between paragraphs, between paragraph 23 and 25 and paragraph 26 to 28, if we wanted to, as it were, move this paragraph up and join these together right here, then we can begin to ask the question, what is the relationship between this paragraph and this following paragraph? And we're helped out, just like we are at the propositional level, by this word for. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest. And then he goes on to describe the characteristics of that high priest here in 26. And then in 27, the nature of his sacrifice. And then the summary of his strength over against the weakness of the former priests. And so this word for, which points us to the relationship of ground, the relationship between a statement and the argument or the reason for that statement, using the word for. And so I can go ahead and label this as ground. Draw my arc over the top. And then I can step back and begin to see if the relationship between these two paragraphs is one of ground, then 26 through 28 becomes further support for this truth of Christ's ability to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. That it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest. And this such a high priest is pointing to this high priest who has such an ability to save, because he always lives to make intercession for them. So then this paragraph is in a subordinate relationship to 23 to 25. In other words, giving greater support, lending its strength, giving support, and is the reason for what came prior to that in verses 23 to 25. Let me give you another example where we don't have such a clear-cut word given to us. Did a video a while back about Galatians 2:15 and 16, and this is those two verses again as I arced them out previously, that Paul is arguing that we ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners, yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law but through faith in Jesus Christ. So we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law no one will be justified. So we had this short series followed by this concessive relationship, yet, even though this is true, yet we know this. And I said in that video that Paul's main point is right here, that he also is believing in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ, even though he's a Jew by birth. He's not finding his hope in that genealogy, but in his faith in Christ. Now, how does this, 15 and 16, relate to the paragraph that came right before that, where he's recalling that when Cephas came to Antioch, Paul opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. So he's remembering a time, and that temporal theme comes through this whole paragraph of 11 to 14. The time when Cephas came to Antioch, and Paul opposed him because, ground, he stood condemned. For prior to that, before certain men had come from James, that's the temporal relationship, Peter was eating, or Cephas was eating with the Gentiles. But when these certain men from James, from Jerusalem, came down, Cephas drew back and separated himself because he was afraid, so we have the ground, because he was afraid of the circumcision party. So that alternate relationship there based on Peter's alternating behavior. And Paul notes the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, with the result that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. So we have an action and a result there that's in series with Cephas's actions there. However, that's set in alternative relationship to when Paul arrived. He saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel. It was not in step with the truth of the gospel. And when, at that time, when he saw that, then he shares an idea, and a further explanation is how I arced this, because he says, I said to Cephas, and then he gives the quote of what it is that he said. So I saw that as an idea and explanation. If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, then, is implied right here, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? That's the idea and the explanation there under this time, this temporal relationship. And all of this, 12 through 14, becomes the ground for why he opposed him to his face and why Peter stood condemned. So the question then I'm asking in this video is, what's the relationship right here between paragraph 11 to 14 and paragraph 15 and 16? What's the relationship right here? And I can move this up, and we can begin to consider what is the relationship, because this is how it flows in the text from one paragraph to another. What is the relationship right at this hinge as these two paragraphs come together? Now, we don't have a handy-dandy word, a keyword, to point us easily like we did in the first example. So then what we can do is just begin to try some keywords on for size. You can also try just summarizing. If I was going to summarize this whole arc in one sentence and then summarize this whole arc, I can begin to think about what is the author's flow of thought. And I can also just try on some key words here. Words like, I can start with coordinate words. I could say, is this a relationship of series right here? And, or maybe it's an alternative, but I came to Antioch, I opposed Peter to his face. I said, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile, not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? And we ourselves are Jews by birth. That doesn't seem to quite capture what's happening here, or but doesn't seem. So I think I can rule out that this is not a coordinate relationship right here. So maybe it's a subordinate relationship. I could try words of result or purpose like so that, or in order that. So that we ourselves are Jews by birth. That doesn't seem to fit. Words of action and manner, in that or by, doesn't seem to fit. Doesn't seem like he's making a comparison here. Even as or like we ourselves are Jews by birth. That doesn't seem to fit. I don't think this is an idea explanation, an idea that then he's explaining further. We wouldn't insert the words that is right here. If you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? That is, we ourselves are Jews by birth. I don't think that's what he's doing here. Which then we're left pretty much with an inference or ground. Is this a relationship of therefore? How can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? Therefore, we ourselves are Jews by birth. Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law. I don't think so. So I think we're left with ground. And I think the word for or because makes the most sense of this relationship right here. It fits this hinge the best. That Paul says, I was opposing Cephas because he stood condemned because of his hypocrisy here, and then all the Jews that acted hypocritically with him. But his conduct and their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel. And so I began to confront them. Because for we ourselves are Jews by birth, Paul says, and not Gentile sinners. And I think I can hear Paul being a little bit sarcastic, borrowing the language, the racially motivated language that was being used to put the Jews up a tier and the Gentiles down a tier. For we ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners, yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So we have also believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ. I think for makes the most sense of this relationship right here. And so that's an example of trying on some different keywords for size to see what best fits the relationship. And so I'm going to go ahead and label this as a ground, and then draw one arc over the top to bring these two paragraphs into relationship right here. Because then I can see that verse 15 and 16, what Paul is arguing here, gives further support to why Peter was out of step with the truth of the gospel. Why was it that Peter was out of step with the gospel? Because we'd find our identity as believers not in our ethnicity, whether it's Jewish or Gentile, but we find our identity, our salvation in Christ Jesus, and we are justified by faith in him. And this becomes uppermost in our identity, but it also becomes uppermost in Paul's argument here as the reason, the support for why he opposed Peter, why he was so adamant that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel. We find further support for that in verses 15 and 16. And so we see this paragraph then is in a subordinate relationship with the paragraph that came previous, 11 to 14. And that's just another example of how I would bring together two paragraphs using the Bible arcing method.